You've just spent your life savings on what might be history's worst travel package. The year is 1350, and you're about to walk hundreds of miles on a journey that could take months, carrying everything you own in a leather pouch. Your hotel tonight? A flea-infested straw mattress shared with 12 strangers who haven't bathed in months. Your dinner? Stale bread and water you'd rather not ask where it came from. But here's the thing that modern travelers don't realize about medieval pilgrimage. This was actually considered the luxury option. Pilgrimage was a real and institutionalized practice across medieval Europe, which means the suffering was both deliberate and systematic. Before you could even begin this nightmare, you had to figure out what to pack for a journey designed to test your faith through physical misery. The first challenge was assembling what medieval pilgrims called their survival kit. Every pilgrim needed the holy trinity of medieval travel: a staff, scrip, and broad-brimmed hat. These three pieces formed the recognized pilgrim uniform that could be blessed by a priest before departure, marking you as a religious traveler rather than a vagrant or bandit. Returning pilgrims often displayed tokens like the scallop shell to prove their journey and gain social currency back home, but each item came with hidden problems that could doom your journey before you'd walked your first mile. That wooden staff everyone carries serves dual purposes as walking aid and blunt deterrent. It's useful for fending off attackers or animals, though it's hardly a knight's lance. The staff needed to be sturdy enough to provide real protection, but light enough to carry for months. Too heavy, and it becomes dead weight. Too light, and it snaps when you actually need it. Equipment choices varied wildly among pilgrims, and poor decisions could prove consequential. Your leather scrip holds everything you own for the next 6 months, often including a bowl and mug that might also be blessed before departure. But it's also a target, advertising exactly how much money you're carrying to every thief between here and Santiago. The bulge of your coin purse shows through the leather. The weight distribution tells experienced bandits whether you're carrying silver or copper. Many pilgrims concealed valuables in seams, hollow staff handles, or sewn into clothing, but bandits had learned exactly where to look for hidden money after centuries of practice. The broad-brimmed hat protects you from sun and rain, except when strong winds turn it into a medieval frisbee that you'll spend hours chasing across muddy fields. These hats were expensive enough that losing one meant weeks of sunburn and soaked clothing. But wearing one marked you as someone who could afford expensive accessories, making you a more attractive target than pilgrims traveling bareheaded. Then there's the practical gear nobody talks about in the pilgrimage guides. Footwear that disintegrates after weeks of rocky roads was a common failure documented among medieval travelers. Water containers developed leaks precisely when crossing arid regions. Food spoiled faster than expected, forcing pilgrims to rely on questionable meals from strangers within days of departure. Pilgrims developed elaborate strategies for hiding wealth, distributing coins throughout their clothing, and creating false bottoms in bags. Some sewed silver into belt, leather, or hid gems inside hollow staff handles. But bandits had perfected counter-strategies over generations. They could spot fake poverty from remarkable distances and knew exactly where desperate travelers hid their money. The irony cuts deep when you realize this. Carefully planned survival kit often made pilgrims more vulnerable, not less. The staff marked you as a traveler rather than a local. The script showed you had money worth stealing. The hat made you visible from miles away to anyone scanning the horizon for potential victims. Your survival gear essentially functioned as a medieval advertisement, announcing that you were carrying portable wealth and had no local protection, but assembling your gear was just the beginning. The real complexity started when you tried to arrange your entire life around a journey with no guaranteed return date. Before you could even think about leaving home, you faced a logistical puzzle that made modern travel planning look like child's play. How do you arrange your entire life around a journey with no guaranteed return date? Medieval pilgrims couldn't check weather forecasts, book hotels in advance, or even know if their destination city would still exist when they arrived. Wars erupted overnight. Plague closed entire regions. Kings died and new rulers banned foreign travelers. Yet you had to make months of preparations based on pure guesswork about conditions that might change completely while you were walking. You needed to appoint overseers for your property, arrange care for your family, and settle all debts. But these legal arrangements often attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention from neighbors who saw opportunity in your absence. Word spread quickly when someone was preparing for pilgrimage. Suddenly, distant relatives appeared with urgent business propositions. Local merchants offered to buy your livestock at suspiciously low prices. Creditors who had ignored your debts for years demanded immediate payment. The property problem created a vicious cycle that trapped many would-be pilgrims. You couldn't leave valuable items unguarded, but hiring guards advertised that you had valuable items worth guarding. Guards themselves posed risks. They knew exactly what you owned and when you'd be gone. Some pilgrims hired multiple guards to watch each other, creating expensive security arrangements that drained travel funds before the journey even began. Weather planning meant packing for every possible climate between spring and winter. Your 6-month journey might stretch to 2 years if you got sick, lost, or robbed multiple times. Summer clothing would rot in winter rain, winter coats would cause heat stroke in Mediterranean regions. You needed to predict weather patterns across multiple countries and seasons while carrying everything on your back. Food preparation involved calculating calories for hundreds of miles of walking. Medieval pilgrims burned enormous energy daily, but had no reliable way to resupply along remote routes. Dried meat spoiled in humid weather, hard bread became inedible rocks, cheese developed colorful molds that could kill you. Most pilgrims discovered that spoilage, theft, and unexpected detours meant they'd be buying questionable meals from strangers within the first week, regardless of how carefully they'd planned their provisions. The social dynamics got even more complex when pilgrims tried to join travel groups. You needed companions for safety, but strangers might rob you, abandon you, or simply walk faster than your aging legs could manage. Some groups disbanded after personality conflicts. Others split up when members got sick or ran out of money. Finding compatible travel partners required negotiating everything from walking pace to religious observances to sleeping arrangements. Many pilgrims spent their last weeks at home receiving visitors who came to say goodbye. These gatherings had an unsettling funeral atmosphere. Since everyone understood the statistical reality, a significant percentage of pilgrims never returned home. Family members grieved in advance. Children said goodbye to parents they might never see again. Spouses made arrangements for potential widowhood. All this careful preparation often proved meaningless the moment pilgrims hit the road and discovered that medieval travel operated by entirely different rules than medieval daily life. Your property contracts became worthless if you died in a foreign country. Your weather preparations failed when climate patterns shifted. Your travel companions revealed their true characters under stress. The comfortable predictability of home life gave way to chaos, where survival depended more on luck than planning. Speaking of different rules, nothing could have prepared them for what waited on the roads themselves. Congratulations! You've made it exactly 12 miles from home before discovering that medieval roads weren't designed for travel. They were designed for suffering. The famous pilgrimage routes that connected Europe weren't paved highways, but muddy tracks that disappeared in bad weather, split into confusing forks without warning, and passed through territories where local lords viewed pilgrims as walking tax opportunities. Your modern GPS would have been useless anyway, since these roads were often just areas where previous travelers had worn down the grass slightly more than the surrounding countryside. Bandits weren't just random criminals lurking in dark forests. They were organized professionals who studied pilgrim routes like modern businesses analyze customer behavior. These entrepreneurs of violence knew exactly when groups would pass certain locations, which pilgrims carried the most money based on their clothing and equipment, and had developed sophisticated techniques for separating travelers from their wealth without technically committing murder. Dead pilgrims couldn't spread word about dangerous areas, but robbed pilgrims made excellent advertising for bandit efficiency. Getting lost wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially fatal. Wandering off established routes meant no access to pilgrim hostels, no legal protections from local authorities, and no fellow travelers to help if you collapsed from exhaustion or injury. Medieval maps were artistic interpretations rather than accurate guides. Landmarks mentioned in travel accounts might have been destroyed by wars, weather, or simple neglect. A wrong turn could add weeks to your journey, or lead you into territories where foreigners weren't just unwelcome but actively hunted. The roads themselves seemed designed by someone who genuinely hated human feet. Rocky sections destroyed shoes within days, forcing pilgrims to walk barefoot over sharp stones. Muddy stretches could swallow a person up to their knees, trapping travelers while their companions debated whether helping was worth the risk of getting stuck themselves. River crossings featured ferry operators who charged whatever they thought you could afford, which often meant everything you had left. Language barriers turned simple interactions into potential disasters. Asking for directions in the wrong dialect could mark you as a foreign pilgrim worth robbing. Regional accents shifted every few miles. A mispronounced word might lead to misunderstandings that sent you marching confidently toward cliffs, bandit camps, or territories controlled by hostile lords who viewed trespassers as legitimate targets for imprisonment or worse. Weather transformed familiar routes into alien landscapes overnight. Spring rains turned footpaths into rushing rivers that swept away bridges and landmarks. Winter snow erased road markers completely, leaving pilgrims to navigate by guesswork through landscapes that looked identical in every direction. Summer heat in southern regions made daytime travel dangerous, forcing night walking when bandits were most active and getting lost was easiest. Even fellow pilgrims posed significant risks. Groups often included criminals using pilgrimage as cover for their escape from local authorities. Mentally unstable individuals sought religious visions through extreme privation that made them unpredictable traveling companions. Desperate people who had run out of money might resort to theft when their own supplies dwindled, turning trusted companions into threats. The road to salvation was literally paved with hazards that claimed more pilgrims than any spiritual test. Every mile became a gamble with death, disability, or destitution as the stakes. Medieval chroniclers recorded countless stories of pilgrims who simply vanished between known locations, leaving families to wonder whether their loved ones had found paradise or just creative methods of dying. Those who survived the roads faced an even more immediate threat, finding somewhere to sleep that wouldn't kill them overnight. The wooden sign swinging in the wind promises food and lodging, but what you actually get is a masterclass in how to cram human misery into the smallest possible space while charging premium prices for the privilege. Pilgrim lodging operated on a simple principle that would horrify modern fire marshals. Inns commonly packed many guests into one hall, regardless of hygiene, health, or basic human dignity. Innkeepers had perfected the art of spatial mathematics, calculating exactly how many travelers they could squeeze into each room before comfort became impossible and complaints grew too loud to ignore. Your private room was actually a communal sleeping hall where dozens of strangers shared the same straw mattresses and unwashed blankets. Privacy meant rolling over without elbowing your neighbor too hard in the ribs. Personal space was measured in inches rather than feet. Animals sometimes shared living spaces or roamed in towns, so separation between people and livestock could be thin. The person next to you might be a wealthy merchant, a deceased beggar, or someone's wandering goat. The bed situation defied modern comprehension in ways that still boggle historians today. You might find yourself sandwiched between a feverish merchant who hadn't stopped sweating for 3 days, a pilgrim with dysentery who made frequent midnight trips to the communal privy, and someone's prized pig that snored louder than a thunderstorm. The straw mattresses hadn't been changed in months, creating ecosystems of bugs, mold, and mysterious stains that had achieved their own personalities. Innkeepers charged extra for everything from straw that wasn't completely rotten to water that hadn't been used to wash horses first. Some provided poor food, overcharged desperate travelers, or found creative ways to separate pilgrims from the remaining coins. Premium services included blankets with fewer holes, sleeping spots near walls instead of in the middle of crowds, and ale that had been brewed this decade rather than the previous one. Towns often lacked sanitation, and ale was sometimes a safer drink than water, which should tell you everything about medieval water quality standards. Bread crawled with weevils that added protein whether you wanted it or not. Meat had turned colors that didn't exist in nature, creating new shades of green and purple that artists would later use to paint dragons. The worst part wasn't the filth, the fleas, or the fungal infections you'd inevitably contract. It was the other guests. Desperate pilgrims sometimes turned to theft when their own resources ran out and they faced the choice between crime and starvation. Your sleeping companions might rifle through your belongings while you dozed, steal your shoes while you weren't looking, or simply disappear with your money during the night. Monasteries and hospitals established along routes offered pilgrims better shelter with cleaner conditions and more reliable food. Monastic hospices provided marginally safer accommodations but came with strict religious schedules that meant mandatory prayers at ungodly hours. Rules could get you expelled for minor infractions like snoring too loudly or failing to participate enthusiastically enough in dawn prayers after walking 20 miles the previous day. A good night's sleep became a luxury so rare that many pilgrims preferred camping outdoors. At least the bugs were wild animals instead of someone else's parasites, and the only snoring you heard was your own echoing off nearby trees. But surviving terrible lodging was just preparation for discovering that your sacred destination held surprises that no guidebook had mentioned. Arriving at your sacred destination, you discovered that medieval fraud made modern internet scams look honest and straightforward. The relic trade was a lucrative and widespread economy around shrines, with churches and merchants profiting from pilgrims buying relics and souvenirs. These entrepreneurs of the sacred had turned salvation into a shopping experience, where spiritual benefits carried precise price tags. Basic math revealed the scope of the problem in ways that should have alarmed more medieval minds. Every major cathedral in Europe claimed to possess the head of John the Baptist, which meant the saint would have resembled a hydra with multiple noggins. Churches displayed enough saint finger bones to suggest most holy figures had dozens of digits per hand, and Virgin Mary hair was so abundant it could stuff several mattresses. Clever scammers developed authentication methods that seemed legitimate to medieval minds but were actually theatrical masterpieces. Certificates written in Latin impressed pilgrims who couldn't read beyond their own names. Elaborate backstories involved miraculous discoveries by pious farmers who just happened to uncover saint bones while plowing fields. Testimonials from previous pilgrims provided social proof, though these miracle stories propagated through pilgrim networks and clerical accounts in ways that made verification nearly impossible. The price structure was brilliantly manipulative in ways that modern marketing executives would admire. Small, affordable relics served as gateway purchases that led to increasingly expensive premium saint parts. You might start with a splinter of wood supposedly from Noah's Ark, then upgrade to a saint's tooth, then eventually spend your entire pilgrimage budget on a piece of St. Peter's sandal. Pilgrims commonly bought ampullae, small sealed flasks containing holy water or oil from shrines, as concentrated traces of the sacred they could carry home. These tokens became prized possessions that demonstrated successful completion of the journey while generating steady revenue for religious sites. Competition between religious sites led to relic arms races that defied both logic and anatomy. Churches constantly discovered new saint body parts that happened to be more powerful than their rivals' collections. If Canterbury Cathedral claimed healing powers from Thomas Becket's blood, competing shrines would suddenly produce Thomas Becket's actual skull, complete with visible martyr wounds. This marketplace dynamic created an environment where outrageous claims became normal business practice. Pilgrims developed their own counter-strategies for detecting fraud, testing relics for obvious fakes, and sharing information about reliable versus fraudulent sites. Some examined bone structures for anatomical accuracy, others compared relic descriptions between different locations. But scammers evolved faster than pilgrim skepticism. staying one step ahead of detection methods by improving their craftsmanship and developing more convincing origin stories. The exhaustion and emotional investment of the journey made pilgrims more receptive to claims of miraculous cure. After walking hundreds of miles through mud, bandits, and disease, travelers needed their sacrifices to mean something profound. This vulnerability created ideal purchasing conditions for religious entrepreneurs who understood that faith, combined with desperation, opened purse strings more effectively than any sales pitch. The relic economy revealed that medieval pilgrimage was as much about commerce as spirituality. Sacred sites functioned as elaborate shopping centers where faith was the currency and hope was the product being sold. Churches competed for pilgrim spending through marketing campaigns that would have impressed later advertising professionals. But fraudulent relics represented just one category of pilgrimage problems that could destroy everything travelers had hoped to achieve. Some pilgrimages didn't just fail. They became cautionary tales that medieval chroniclers recorded as warnings about what happened when spiritual ambition met practical reality in the most spectacular ways possible. Medieval records document pilgrimage disasters that range from individually tragic to collectively catastrophic, revealing how quickly religious journeys could transform into survival nightmares that destroyed everything pilgrims had hoped to achieve. These weren't just unlucky accidents, but systematic failures that exposed the fundamental dangers of medieval travel. Entire pilgrim groups sometimes vanished without trace, leaving behind only scattered belongings and confused family members who spent years wondering whether their loved ones had found salvation or simply found creative ways to die in foreign countries. The 1064 German pilgrimage to Jerusalem started with 7,000 participants but ended with maybe 300 survivors reaching home. The rest disappeared into mass graves, slave markets, or unmarked burial sites across hostile territories, where foreign Christians weren't particularly treasured. Disease outbreaks turned pilgrimage routes into death corridors faster than medieval medicine could respond. Overcrowded hospices became plague incubators that spread infection more efficiently than pilgrims could flee to safety. The cramped sleeping conditions that already made rest impossible now guaranteed that one sick traveler could infect dozens of companions overnight. These rolling epidemics followed pilgrimage routes like invisible armies, striking down travelers who had survived bandits and starvation only to succumb to microscopic enemies they couldn't see or fight. Some pilgrims returned home to discover that their carefully arranged property management had failed spectacularly during their absence. Overseers had stolen everything valuable and disappeared. Family members had died without proper care while trusted neighbors ignored their responsibilities. Homes had been claimed by creditors who assumed the pilgrims were permanently gone and treated abandoned property as fair game for seizure. These returning pilgrims found themselves homeless strangers in their own towns. Weather disasters caught pilgrim groups in mountain passes or desert regions, where survival skills mattered more than spiritual devotion. Alpine storms trapped travelers for weeks without adequate food or shelter. Desert heat killed pilgrims who had underestimated water requirements for crossing hostile terrain. These situations revealed the ugly truth about human nature under extreme stress. As religious companions turned into competitors for limited resources, fighting over scraps while their shared faith provided no practical protection against exposure or starvation. Political conflicts transformed pilgrimage routes into war zones overnight, catching travelers between armies that viewed foreigners as potential spies or legitimate targets. Pilgrims found themselves accused of espionage simply for carrying letters or maps. Soldiers from all sides robbed travelers who carried portable wealth through contested territories, treating pilgrim groups as mobile treasure chests rather than protected religious processions. The substitute pilgrim system created its own unique disasters when hired pilgrims took payment and disappeared completely. Some completed fake pilgrimages to nearby towns instead of distant shrines, returning with fabricated stories and forged documents. Others died en route, leaving their employers both spiritually and financially cheated, with no way to verify whether their purchased salvation had any validity whatsoever. These catastrophic failures reveal that medieval pilgrimage was essentially a massive gambling system, where people bet their lives, families, and fortunes on journeys that succeeded just often enough to keep the tradition alive, despite horrific odds. The real question wasn't why so many pilgrimages failed, but how any succeeded at all in a world that seemed specifically designed to punish spiritual ambition with relentless physical suffering. The historical record shows a clear pattern across centuries. Pilgrimages were institutionalized across Europe to Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago, encouraged by church practice and producing both devotion and commerce. Medieval pilgrimage reveals that the gap between spiritual aspirations and practical reality has remained remarkably consistent across time. People have always been willing to suffer tremendously for beliefs that promise meaning beyond daily existence. The next time you complain about airline food or hotel Wi-Fi, remember that your medieval predecessors considered it a successful day if they avoided dysentery, bandits, and sleeping next to someone else's livestock. These stories remind us that human determination can be simultaneously inspiring and extreme by our standards, and that sometimes the most profound historical lessons come from understanding just how much our ancestors were willing to endure for faith, hope, and the chance to touch something sacred. If you enjoyed hearing how travel used to be worse, subscribe for more quietly savage histories. What if I told you that the world's most extensive wall system wasn't built in China, but in Africa? And what if I told you that this engineering marvel, which took centuries to construct and dwarfed every other fortification on Earth, was almost completely wiped from existence in a single military campaign? The walls of Benin stretched for thousands of miles around one of Africa's greatest medieval cities. They involved more earth-moving than the pyramids. They protected a kingdom so wealthy that European visitors compared it favorably to their own capitals. So why have you probably never heard of them? Archaeologists estimate the project may have taken on the order of 150 million man-hours over many centuries. Now imagine you're one of those workers, standing knee-deep in red African clay, with nothing but wooden tools and your bare hands. What exactly were you building? Around 800 CE, workers in the Kingdom of Benin began the most ambitious earthworks project in human history. Their technique sounds almost embarrassingly simple when you hear it described. You dig enormous inner moats. Then you use all that excavated red clay to build massive outer ramparts right next to them. That's it. Dig hole, build wall, repeat for 600 years. Construction likely began as early as around 800 CE and continued into the mid-1400s. But the devil lived in the details, and those details had teeth. Workers had to dig through tropical soil during monsoon seasons, when the ground turned into a muddy nightmare that stuck to everything. They hauled millions of tons of earth by hand, basket by basket, under a heat that made every task slower and stickier. No machinery, no wheelbarrows, just human muscle and determination. Each section required precise engineering that would impress modern contractors. In places, the ramparts reached up to about 20 meters high. That's roughly 6 stories tall. Archaeological descriptions note timber reinforcement and palisades used at some sections, with massive wooden beams driven deep into the clay foundation. The engineering knowledge passed from father to son, master to apprentice, across generations of mud-covered specialists who knew exactly how to make dirt stand up and fight. Then someone discovered that mixing palm oil into the earth created walls that became slippery during rainstorms. Imagine trying to scale a 6-story wall that's actively trying to slide you back down into a moat. The walls became natural slip and slides of doom for anyone stupid enough to attack during the wet season. The construction continued for generations. Some field estimates model intensive phases requiring roughly 1,000 organized workers, though exact figures are uncertain. Archaeological models and oral histories imply organized labor practices. Rotation of workers and long-running apprenticeship traditions likely helped keep the work going through decades of political changes, droughts, and tropical diseases that could wipe out entire work gangs. What started as basic fortifications around a single settlement evolved into something unprecedented. The system grew outward like a living organism, creating a sophisticated, multi-tiered defense network that eventually spanned thousands of miles around Benin City. Inner walls protected the royal palace. Middle walls enclosed residential districts. Outer walls controlled access to farmland and trade routes. By the 1400s, this centuries-long construction marathon had created the world's largest earthwork system. The combined length exceeded 10,000 miles, longer than the Great Wall of China. The volume of earth moved surpassed the Great Pyramid of Giza. This fortress represented one of history's most ambitious construction projects, built entirely by hand in one of the most challenging climates imaginable. So, what did they build beyond a defensive ditch? They created a geometric masterpiece that organized the entire city according to mathematical principles so sophisticated that modern scholars are still studying them. At the heart of this massive fortification lay one of Africa's most ingeniously planned cities, built around what scholars like Ron Eglash have argued was a fractal design. The palace, districts, and compounds all followed similar layouts at different scales. From the Oba's palace at the center, historical accounts describe about 30 principal avenues, roughly 37 meters wide, radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. These weren't random paths that evolved over time. They were deliberately planned streets intersected by perpendicular roads forming a precise grid. The planners counted, they measured, they made sure everything lined up with geometric precision that would impress a modern city engineer. The city was divided into 11 administrative sections, each one a perfect microcosm of the royal court's hierarchical structure. If you understood how the palace worked, you could navigate any neighborhood in the city. The same architectural logic repeated everywhere. Courtyards, entrances, ceremonial spaces all followed identical organizational principles. Underground drainage channels formed an invisible network beneath the streets, engineered to move stormwater away from the streets while fitting within the city's overall planning. These weren't simple ditches. They were waterways that prevented flooding while keeping the geometric street pattern intact during the heaviest tropical rains. The walls themselves created a series of controlled zones, with 9 fortified gates that regulated movement and commerce throughout the urban landscape. Movement was regulated. Gates and walls channeled traffic in ways that reflected social rank and administration. Each gate controlled access to specific districts, creating checkpoints that guided people through predetermined routes according to social hierarchy. Each compound within the city mirrored the palace's architectural logic, recursive symmetry that created visual harmony across neighborhoods and districts. Walk through any residential area and you'd see the same proportions, the same spatial relationships, the same organizational patterns that defined the royal court. Every family compound was a miniature version of the Oba's palace, scaled down but maintaining identical geometric relationships. European visitors in the 1600s compared Benin's urban planning favorably to Lisbon, marveling at streets that ran straight and as far as the eye could see. These weren't medieval European cities with narrow, winding alleys. Benin's streets were wide, straight, and organized according to mathematical principles that European cities wouldn't adopt for centuries. At night, these perfectly planned streets must have felt remarkably quiet and secure, with their geometric order creating an almost sacred sense of protection within the walls. This wasn't just city planning, it was political geometry, where every street, compound, and gate reinforced the Oba's authority through mathematical precision. It helped run the kingdom. The walls themselves became the foundation of royal authority and economic power. For centuries, the walls of Benin stood as silent guardians of one of Africa's most prosperous kingdoms. But these earthen barriers functioned as much more than physical defenses. They were political boundaries that encoded the Oba's power directly into the landscape. Every moat and rampart served as a constant reminder of who ruled and who obeyed. The moat and rampart system created sacred spaces around the royal palace, controlling who could approach the seat of power and when. Access to the Oba was tightly managed. Approaches were ceremonial and controlled. The walls forced visitors through specific gates at predetermined times, creating a choreographed approach that reinforced royal authority with every step. Each barrier reminded you that you were entering increasingly sacred territory. Different sections carried spiritual significance, associated with specific deities and ancestors, making the walls both fortress and shrine. Certain portions belonged to particular gods. Others honored dead rulers. The walls weren't just mud and wood. They were religious architecture that connected the living kingdom to its spiritual foundations. Guards at these sections weren't just soldiers. They were priests, protecting holy ground. The fortifications helped regulate bustling markets where European traders exchanged goods, with Portuguese merchants noting the kingdom's impressive wealth and organization. These walls didn't isolate Benin from the world. They controlled access to one of Africa's richest trading centers. Merchants from across continents passed through those gates, carrying ivory, pepper, palm oil, textiles, and later, regrettably, participating in the slave trade. Benin's economy was multifaceted, and the walls created choke points where the kingdom could tax, inspect, and control this diverse commerce. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Benin had become a major player in regional trade networks, its protected capital drawing merchants from across West Africa and Europe. European visitors compared Benin City favorably to Lisbon: houses, wide streets, and a palace to match. The walls advertised prosperity as much as they protected it. Any rival kingdom looking at those massive fortifications understood they were facing serious wealth and organizational power. The walls served as a visible statement to rival powers like the Oyo Kingdom and northern Muslim states, a declaration that Benin could defend its prosperity. These were earthworks you could see from miles away, announcing to everyone that Benin had the manpower, resources, and engineering skills to build something unprecedented. The message was clear: attack us at your own risk. The city behind these walls became legendary for its security and prosperity. People lived in such comfort that they saw no need for doors on their houses. The walls created such effective protection that residents felt completely safe from external threats. For over 600 years, these walls successfully defended not just a city, but an entire way of life, built on sophisticated governance, trade, and cultural achievement. For centuries, the walls announced prosperity, 1AC. Then, in 1897, they were deliberately targeted, 1A0. 5. In February 1897, British forces under Sir Harry Rawson began systematically destroying what had taken 6 centuries to build. The punitive expedition arrived in Benin City with a clear mission that went far beyond simple conquest. They needed to completely dismantle the kingdom's power structure, and those massive earthworks represented everything they wanted to eliminate. After capturing the city, British forces methodically filled in sections of the massive moats that had protected Benin for generations. They brought equipment specifically for neutralizing the towering ramparts. This wasn't random destruction during the heat of battle. This was calculated demolition work carried out over weeks and months. Soldiers shoveled tons of earth back into moats that had taken generations to excavate. Archaeological and historical accounts describe concerted efforts to fill, level, or otherwise neutralize sections of the defensive network. The excavated earth from destroyed walls was repurposed for colonial infrastructure projects, literally building British control from the rubble of Benin's defenses. Roads, administrative buildings, and military installations rose from the clay that had once protected African kings. The British recycled the kingdom's fortifications into the physical infrastructure of colonial rule. Meanwhile, soldiers looted the royal palace with industrial efficiency. They seized thousands of bronze artifacts, ivory carvings, and ceremonial objects with systematic precision. About 900 pieces eventually ended up in the British Museum, though countless more disappeared into private collections across Europe. The palace's intricate carvings were burned or broken. Oral histories and later scholars lament the loss of that craft knowledge. The destruction went far beyond physical structures. British forces disrupted the transmission of engineering knowledge that had maintained these walls for centuries. The master builders who knew wall construction techniques were killed, scattered, or silenced. The apprenticeship systems that passed knowledge from generation to generation were shattered. Centuries of accumulated expertise died with the kingdom. Colonial rule disrupted the social and administrative systems, the guilds, apprenticeships, and ceremonial practices that had coordinated construction and upkeep, making large-scale maintenance far more difficult. They eliminated the administrative positions that had coordinated maintenance across thousands of miles of fortifications. Within months, walls that had withstood tropical storms, enemy attacks, and the passage of centuries lay in ruins, their defensive network severed forever. The moat and rampart system that had protected one of Africa's greatest civilizations became disconnected fragments scattered across the landscape. The coordinated defense network that had taken 600 years to build was broken beyond repair in less than a year. The 1897 expedition didn't just defeat the kingdom. It erased the physical and cultural infrastructure that had made Benin civilization possible. The British understood that destroying the walls meant destroying the kingdom's ability to reconstitute itself. What colonial forces didn't finish, time would continue. Today, fragments of the world's largest earthwork system survive scattered across modern Nigeria, but finding them requires knowing exactly where to look. You can still stumble across sections if you know what you're looking for, but most people drive right past them without realizing they're crossing ancient defensive lines that once protected kings. Sections of ancient moats still exist, though many have been filled in for roads, housing developments, and modern infrastructure projects. Walk through certain neighborhoods in Benin City, and you're literally walking on top of centuries-old earthworks. That slight depression running behind the shopping center, that's probably a filled-in moat. The raised area where they built the school, that might be the remains of a rampart that once stood 20 meters tall. Portions are protected on paper since 1961, and the site was placed on UNESCO's tentative list in 1995, but enforcement and funding are patchy. The laws say you can't destroy the walls. Reality says you can bulldoze them if nobody's watching, and the government doesn't have money to stop you. Urban expansion, reuse of earth for building, and even dumping have obscured many sections. Surveys and local reports regularly find remnants during development. Preservation is uneven. The World Monuments Fund has recently highlighted urgent conservation needs, as remaining wall segments face ongoing threats from urban expansion. Every year brings new housing projects, shopping centers, and roads. Modern development and scarce resources make preservation difficult. Meanwhile, online misinformation proliferates, with photos circulating online often showing unrelated African sites like Great Zimbabwe or Sangbo's Eredo, mislabeled as the walls of Benin. Genuine photographs are rare and usually show overgrown, eroded mounds that don't make impressive images, so people substitute more photogenic ruins from completely different countries and continents. UNESCO acknowledged their global significance nearly 3 decades ago. They're still on the tentative list. Meanwhile, developers keep building on top of the archaeological evidence that would support the nomination. Nigeria's planned Edo Museum of West African Art, designed by David Ajayi, aims to house returned bronzes and restore cultural memory. The museum acknowledges what was lost while trying to preserve what remains. It's a physical reminder that the walls existed, even as the walls themselves continue vanishing. The walls live now as fragments, memory, and patchwork protections, caught between recognition of their historical importance and the relentless pressure of modern development. Their near invisibility reveals something troubling about how monumental achievements can simply fade away. The walls of Benin remind us that history's greatest achievements can vanish not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet neglect and systematic erasure. No earthquakes brought down these earthworks. No natural disasters destroyed them overnight. They disappeared through deliberate destruction, followed by decades of indifference. Their story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what else we've forgotten. How many other monumental human accomplishments have been erased from popular consciousness? What engineering marvels, artistic achievements, and sophisticated civilizations have simply been written out of the history books? The answer is probably more than you want to know. The next time someone mentions ancient wonders, remember that the most extensive fortification system in human history once protected a city in Africa. Then ask yourself, what else you've never heard of? The silence might surprise you. You've seen the movies. The mysterious prisoner in the Iron Mask, locked away for being the secret twin of the Sun King. Here's the thing though. No contemporary documentary evidence supports an iron mask. Officials recorded a black velvet face covering used in limited circumstances, while Voltaire later recast it as iron. Not a horror prop, but a practical disguise. And the prisoner? Probably not a prince. More likely a valet named Eustache, who got a bit too chatty about state secrets. You probably prefer the twin conspiracy, but the paperwork has other plans. This man was held for 34 years under the same jailer across 4 different prisons, dying at the Bastille in November 1703. Tonight, we're dismantling one of history's most persistent myths. And the truth starts with some fascinatingly boring prison records from 1669. The arrest happens fast and bureaucratically boring. On July 19, 1669, the Marquis de Louvois writes detailed instructions to Saint Mars about preparing a cell. 9 days later, Captain Alexandre de Vauroy picks up this guy named Eustache Dogger near Calais, probably wondering why he's arresting someone whose biggest crime was gossiping about his boss. By August 24, Dogger arrives at Pignerol prison. Here's a man whose career highlight was folding laundry and serving wine, yet is about to become more famous than most actual royalty. The paperwork reveals everything. Louvois describes him as only a valet, while ordering a cell with multiple doors to prevent eavesdropping, daily food delivery, and death threats if Dogger mentions anything beyond his immediate needs. It's like installing a nuclear bunker for someone who can't keep their mouth shut at dinner parties. Even the spelling of his name looks deliberately messy. Eustache Dogger appears written in different handwriting, added later, like someone was playing medieval autocorrect with his identity. Imagine being so spectacularly bad at keeping secrets that the King of France personally orders your permanent silence. His job description involved maintaining clothing, serving meals, and running errands, not exactly CIA-level intelligence gathering. But being a valet in 17th century France practically ruled out aristocratic identity, since protocol made a gentleman serving as a manservant completely implausible. The guards treat him like he's storing nuclear launch codes in his head, when he probably just knew which nobleman was sleeping with whose wife. The bureaucratic machine kicks into overdrive. In 1675, Louvois permits Dogger to serve Nicolas Fouquet, another high-profile prisoner, but only when the regular servant La Rivière was ill, and with strict orders preventing contact with other prisoners. It's like hiring someone who can't keep secrets to work closely with someone who has even more secrets, but under maximum security conditions. Years later, Louvois writes to Fouquet asking whether Dogger had ever spoken about what he was employed to do before being brought to Pignerol. This single question reveals everything. They're not worried about who Dogger was, but what he knew, Saint-Mars starts moving this guy between 4 different prisons like he's relocating witness protection, except the witness is a servant who talk too much at parties, from Pignerol to Exils to Sainte Marguerite to the Bastille. It's the grand tour of French imprisonment. When they finally scraped and whitewashed his cell after his death in 1703, destroying all his belongings, they were erasing evidence of what was probably the most boring state secret in French history. But somewhere along this 34-year journey, something interesting happened. The man responsible for keeping this secret started making sure everyone knew there was a secret worth keeping. Benigni Davani de Saint-Mars understood that mysterious prisoners are basically job security with a side of fame. This former musketeer climbed the ranks by realizing the more dramatic and secretive his prisoners appeared, the more important he became by association, like being a nightclub bouncer who knows the longer the line outside, the cooler the club seems inside. Saint-Mars starts with Nicolas Fouquet, the disgraced former superintendent of finances at Pignerol prison. Successfully babysitting a fallen government official proves he can handle sensitive cases without letting them escape or die inconveniently. It's medieval resume building at its finest, and managing high-profile prisoners becomes his fast track to prestige in the French prison system. Here's where things get interesting. Saint-Mars begins dropping hints that his masked prisoner is actually someone incredibly important. A Marshal of France, maybe a Duke, possibly someone even more significant than a chatty valet. Contemporary records show Saint-Mars imposed the face-covering and secrecy measures himself, not following orders from Louvois, but creating his own theatrical security protocols. He feeds curious observers what amounts to historical fan fiction about his own prisoner, and he later admits he told tall tales to make fun of them. The man is literally manufacturing rumors about his own prisoner, turning mundane guard duty into performance art. He moves Dogger through 4 prisons like a traveling circus act: Pignerol, Exils, Sainte Marguerite, and finally the Bastille, each transfer conducted with extreme secrecy and covered litters. These aren't just security measures, they're carefully orchestrated publicity stunts. Every move adds another layer of mystique, like a magician who never reveals the trick because the mystery pays better than the truth. Court gossip starts swirling that this prisoner might be a royal elder brother, and Saint-Mars does absolutely nothing to discourage these wild theories. In fact, he actively cultivates them. The warden has created the perfect feedback loop. The more mysterious he makes his prisoner seem, the more prestigious his own position becomes. It's 17th century personal branding, complete with manufactured intrigue and strategic information leaks. Princess Palatine spreads stories about 2 musketeers ready to kill the prisoner if he removes his mask, which sounds impressively dramatic, until you remember this entire mythology started with a servant who couldn't keep his mouth shut about workplace gossip. The escalation from chatty employee to guarded by armed men represents centuries of bureaucratic telephone. When Saint-Mars becomes governor of the Bastille in 1698, he insists on bringing this prisoner with him, the critical step in converting a low-status valet into a highly visible legend at France's most prestigious prison. The beautiful irony emerges clearly. Saint-Mars transforms routine prison security into theatrical performance, proving that even in the 1600s, people understood the power of perception management. But this carefully crafted mystery was about to find its perfect amplifier in someone who specialized in turning court gossip into political weapons. Voltaire watches court gossip and weaponizes it into a full-scale attack on absolute monarchy, because nothing says "down with tyranny" like a good conspiracy theory. The philosopher hears whispers about a mysterious masked prisoner and thinks, this needs more political drama and a secret twin brother. It's like taking a boring office scandal and turning it into a Netflix series about government corruption. In works like The Age of Louis XIV in 1751 and Questions sur l'Encyclopédie in 1771, he transforms the story into an Enlightenment critique. Absolutism literally hides dangerous truths behind masks. He used it as a powerful metaphor to critique absolutism. The metaphor writes itself. Kings lock away inconvenient truths, just like they lock away inconvenient people. Every mask becomes a symbol of royal secrecy. Every hidden face represents the monarchy's contempt for transparency. It's political poetry disguised as historical investigation. The genius move is popularizing the mask as iron instead of velvet, because iron sounds oppressive and brutal, while velvet just sounds like expensive theater props. Voltaire understands marketing better than most advertisers. Iron conjures images of medieval torture devices and industrial oppression. Velvet suggests luxury and comfort. When crafting anti-monarchy propaganda, the material choice matters more than the historical accuracy. He appears to have mischaracterized the mask as iron with a chin piece, an error that shaped later legend. Voltaire's thought process becomes transparent here. A valet with state secrets, boring administrative cover-up, a secret twin locked away to protect the throne, revolutionary potential. He presents zero evidence for the twin theory, but it doesn't matter because it perfectly fits his narrative about the corruption of absolute power. The story transforms from mundane prison management into existential threat to royal legitimacy. The story becomes less about historical truth and more about political messaging. Every masked prisoner becomes a symbol of royal tyranny. Every hidden identity represents the monarchy's willingness to destroy lives for political convenience. Voltaire creates a template for political critique that turns specific historical incidents into universal condemnations of authoritarian power. His version spreads across Europe faster than actual news, proving that people prefer exciting lies to boring documentation. The Iron Mask story travels from salon to salon, each retelling adding more dramatic flourishes and political significance. It becomes the perfect dinner party conversation starter, scandalous enough to be entertaining, political enough to sound sophisticated. Court records show a chatty valet dying in obscurity. Voltaire's propaganda shows a royal twin sacrificed to protect dynastic succession. The philosopher understands that effective political criticism requires compelling narratives, not accurate documentation. Truth serves the story, not the other way around. Voltaire converted a gossip file into political ammunition. Dumas later turned it into soap opera gold. His fictional twin brother becomes more historically real to most people than the actual valet who probably died forgotten in his cell, proving that sometimes the most effective truth is the one that never actually happened. Alexandre Dumas takes Voltaire's political pamphlet and thinks, this needs more sword fights and a proper happy ending, thus completing the transformation from prison records to swashbuckling adventure. In the Vicomte de Bragelonne, the final part of his D'Artagnan romances published between 1848 and 1850, the novelist faces a classic writer's dilemma, historical accuracy or entertaining plot, and chooses entertainment so decisively it breaks the historical accuracy meter. It's like choosing Marvel movies over documentary footage, then adding superhero costumes to actual historical figures. He takes the twin brother concept and adds musketeer rescues, palace intrigue, and enough dramatic irony to power a small theater district. D'Artagnan and his companions become the heroes who discover the conspiracy, fight for justice, and attempt to restore the rightful king to his throne. The story transforms from boring state security into an adventure novel where good triumphs over evil through sword fighting and clever plotting. The real masterstroke is making the story about justice and family loyalty instead of boring state security, because readers want heroes, not bureaucrats. Dumas understands that audiences prefer clear moral lines, evil kings hiding away rightful heirs versus administrative officials managing chatty employees. His version includes secret passages, dramatic reveals, and climactic confrontations that the actual prison records conspicuously lack. Dumas essentially gives real historical figures superpowers, in this case, secret royal blood, DC, and lets them save the day. Louis XIV becomes the villain who imprisons his own twin brother to protect his throne. The masked prisoner becomes a tragic hero whose noble bearing and mysterious circumstances inspire loyalty and sympathy. The story gains mythic proportions that transcend mundane historical documentation. His version becomes the definitive story for most people, completely overshadowing centuries of actual historical research with pure narrative satisfaction. The twin gets rescued, the evil king gets his comeuppance, and justice prevails. Everything the real story conspicuously lacks. Most modern screen adaptations, including the 1998 film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, draw on Dumas's romantic twin story rather than archival records. Audiences prefer this version because it provides the emotional resolution and moral clarity that messy bureaucratic truth rarely delivers. Dumas proves that good storytelling can completely rewrite history in the public imagination, turning a possible valet into a romantic hero. His novel includes elements like noble sacrifice, brotherly love, and the triumph of truth over tyranny. These themes resonate more powerfully than administrative cover-ups and bureaucratic secrecy. This demonstrates how literature doesn't just reflect history, it actively creates the history that people choose to remember and believe. The tragic comedy emerges clearly. Dumas's fictional version is now more historically true in popular culture than any amount of actual evidence could ever be. But here's the thing about actual evidence. Sometimes it just disappears entirely, leaving historians scrambling to piece together fragments of what might have been a perfectly solvable mystery. The Bastille archives contained hundreds of thousands of documents that could have solved this mystery definitively. On July 14, 1789, when revolutionary crowds stormed the fortress, they find rooms full of prisoner records, but they're focused on liberation, not documentation. Papers get stolen as souvenirs, burned for warmth, or tossed like confetti during street celebrations. Revolutionary fervor makes terrible archival policy. The mystery persists partly because the evidence literally went up in smoke, leaving historians to piece together fragments like archaeological detectives working with broken pottery shards. A commission tries salvaging what remains, but most boxes are already emptied or destroyed. They're left with a massive pile of disordered papers, many damaged beyond recognition. The surviving fragments get moved to various libraries, where they sit neglected for decades. What survives gets reorganized by archivists who are basically trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half might be fake. In 1797, Hubert Pascal Amelon becomes chief librarian and secures protection for the remaining archives. But 600,000 documents overwhelm the librarians, so everything gets stored in a back room for over 40 years. François Ravesson rediscovers the archives in 1840, starting a 50-year restoration process. This painstaking work eventually allows modern historians like Georges Mongredienne to make crucial breakthroughs. In its comprehensive 1952 study, Mongredienne eliminates dozens of proposed candidates by cross-referencing surviving prison records, concluding that only the prisoner arrested as Eustache Dauger in 1669 could have died in the Bastille in 1703. This makes him the only viable archival candidate for the Masked Man. Modern historians consult documents from multiple institutions: the Foreign Ministry, archives, National Archives, various libraries, trying to reconstruct truth from scattered fragments. The revolution that toppled absolutism also scattered the documents that might have ended the myth decades earlier, and only systematic archival work allowed historians to narrow the field to Eustache Dauger. The irony is crushing. Revolutionary enthusiasm accidentally preserved the legend while destroying the evidence. This demonstrates how historical truth is often more fragile than historical myth, and how the absence of evidence becomes evidence for whatever story people prefer. Some mysteries persist not because they're unsolvable, but because the solution got accidentally destroyed during a moment of political enthusiasm, leaving us with romantic legends instead of boring bureaucratic truth. What emerges from this documentary chaos reveals something fascinating about how myths actually get built. You've witnessed the birth of a myth, how a talkative valet, a self-promoting jailer, a political philosopher, and a romance novelist accidentally collaborated across centuries to create one of history's most enduring mysteries. Each contributor added their own layer of fiction until the original boring truth disappeared completely under centuries of storytelling. Modern archival scholarship makes the lowly valet explanation far more plausible than royal twin theories. Contemporary documents describe Dauger as only a valet. Louvois's instructions treat him as a servant who knew too much. Saint Mars openly boasted about manufacturing mystery, and historians like Mongredian, Nowan, and Petit-Fils used systematic archival work to eliminate other candidates. The evidence points to workplace gossip, not dynastic conspiracy. The Man in the Iron Mask reveals something profound about human nature. We'll always choose an exciting question over a boring answer, even when the boring answer is probably true. The real lesson isn't who was behind the mask. It's how gossip, ambition, and a few dramatic writers built a mystery that outlived the evidence. Next time you encounter a historical mystery, ask yourself, are you looking for the truth, or are you looking for a story worth telling? Picture Rome's legendary fire department, brave soldiers racing through marble streets with gleaming equipment, ready to save the eternal city. Now, meet the actual vigiles, sleep-deprived former slaves carrying leather buckets and vinegar-soaked blankets, funded by a tax on slave sales and nicknamed Little Bucket Fellows by Romans who watched them stumble through the streets at night. Augustus established this force in AD 6, combining night watch and police duties with firefighting, but their tools and training were often mismatched to the massive conflagrations that could consume entire neighborhoods. The emperor had his reasons for creating this particular solution to Rome's burning problem. Augustus didn't wake up one morning thinking Rome needs heroes with buckets 0, 5. He had a very different problem in mind. By 6 AD, Rome had transformed into a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million people, crammed into rickety apartment buildings that caught fire with alarming regularity. But fires were just one symptom of a larger disease eating away at imperial control. Mobs rioted in the streets, gangs of slaves and freedmen caused chaos after dark, and the city's narrow alleys had become lawless territories, where Roman citizens feared to walk. The emperor faced a political puzzle that required careful calculation. He needed a force to patrol the streets and maintain order, but calling it what it was, a police force, might remind Romans uncomfortably of military occupation. So, Augustus wrapped his urban control system in the appealing package of public safety. He created the Vigiles, ostensibly Rome's fire department, but designed from the ground up as a surveillance and control apparatus that happened to carry buckets. The funding mechanism revealed his true priorities. Rather than using general tax revenue that might anger Roman citizens, Augustus imposed a 4% tax on slave sales to pay for his new force. This wasn't just clever accounting, it was social engineering. The tax turned the slave trade into the funding source for the very people who would police former slaves and freedmen throughout the city. Augustus structured the Vigiles like a military unit, because that's exactly what they were. 7 cohorts of roughly 1,000 men each patrolled Rome's 14 districts under the command of a praefectus vigilum who reported directly to the emperor. Each cohort operated from a fire station that doubled as a police barracks, complete with detention cells and interrogation rooms. The men lived in military-style dormitories and followed strict hierarchical command structures that had nothing to do with firefighting efficiency and everything to do with maintaining order. The recruitment strategy served multiple purposes beyond simply finding cheap labor. By drawing primarily from freedmen and urban poor, Augustus created a force that owed their livelihoods entirely to imperial patronage. These men had no independent wealth or political connections that might threaten imperial authority. Better yet, their low social status meant they could police the streets without upper-class Romans feeling their dignity was threatened by social equals wielding authority over them. Imperial propaganda painted the vigiles as Rome's protectors, guardians who sacrificed their safety for the public good. The reality was far more cynical. Augustus had created a quasi-military police force that used fire prevention as cover for comprehensive urban surveillance. They monitored who moved through the streets at night, tracked suspicious gatherings, and maintained detailed intelligence on potential troublemakers throughout the city. This political foundation poisoned everything about their operations. When your primary mission is social control rather than fire suppression, you end up with an organization optimized for intimidation rather than emergency response. The Romans had a nickname for their firefighters that tells you everything about their effectiveness: 0. 5. They called them Spartioli, which translates roughly to little bucket fellows. When ordinary Romans spotted these men shuffling through the streets with their equipment, they didn't feel safer. They felt like they were watching the world's most expensive janitors prepare to lose a fight against physics. You'd expect a civilization that built a pantheon and engineered aqueducts spanning hundreds of miles to equip their firefighters with something impressive. Instead, the vigiles carried leather buckets that leaked, hemp ropes that snapped under pressure, and wooden ladders that splintered at inconvenient moments. Their primary weapon against Rome's frequent fires was a collection of sponges attached to long poles, which they used to splash water in the general direction of flames while hoping for the best. The crown jewel of their firefighting arsenal was the centones, patchwork quilts soaked in water or vinegar that firefighters threw over burning sections of buildings. Picture a group of grown men frantically beating flames with soggy blankets while an entire apartment block turns into an inferno around them. These centones were supposed to smother fires through some combination of moisture and wishful thinking, but mostly they just created impressive clouds of steam before catching fire themselves. Roman engineers did attempt to upgrade their firefighting technology with the siphona, hand-pumped devices that could theoretically spray water with enough force to matter. Unfortunately, these pumps required multiple men to operate, constantly jammed when debris clogged the intake valves, and produced water pressure roughly equivalent to a modern garden sprinkler. During actual emergencies, the siphona usually broke down within minutes, leaving firefighters standing around expensive broken equipment while buildings burned. The Romans occasionally deployed ballistae, military siege engines, to launch containers of water or vinegar at burning buildings. This represented the cutting edge of Roman firefighting technology, using weapons designed to destroy city walls to throw liquid at fires from a distance. The results were about as effective as you'd imagine, since catapults aren't known for their precision when targeting specific burning sections of multi-story buildings. Their basic toolkit rounded out with brooms for sweeping away burning debris, hooks for pulling down wooden structures, and various sharp tools for chopping through doors and walls. The vigiles essentially functioned as a demolition crew that occasionally threw water around. They were better equipped to tear buildings apart than to save them. The gap between Roman architectural genius and Roman firefighting equipment was staggering. The same empire that perfected concrete and built structures that still stand today sent firefighters into action with gear that wouldn't pass inspection at a modern summer camp. Rome's firefighters were equipped like maintenance workers, trying to stop volcanic eruptions with mops and spray bottles. So, when night fell across the Eternal City, these poorly equipped former slaves grabbed their leaky buckets and soggy blankets, then headed out to patrol the streets, where they discovered just how many ways their inadequate equipment could fail them. The reality of working these shifts created a nightmare that went far beyond fighting fires. Imagine being a sleep-deprived former slave, carrying buckets through dark Roman streets, knowing you're expected to be both firefighter and police officer while citizens look down on you as barely human. This was the nightly reality for thousands of vigiles who discovered that their job description included everything except adequate sleep or respect. Each night, 7 cohorts spread across 14 regions of Rome, like butter scraped too thin over bread. A single cohort of roughly 1,000 men had to patrol 2 entire districts, respond to fires, arrest criminals, and maintain public order across neighborhoods that could stretch for miles. The math was simple and depressing. There were never enough men for the job, and everyone knew it. Their patrol routes took them through every corner of their assigned districts, checking for early signs of fire like overheated ovens or carelessly placed oil lamps. But between these fire prevention rounds, they caught runaway slaves trying to escape in the darkness, arrested burglars breaking into shops, and broke up fights between drunk citizens. One scholarly estimate suggests the vigiles answered many small alarms daily, countless kitchen blazes and chimney smoke, only a few of which were true city-threatening conflagrations. Some nights, they spent more time wrestling criminals than fighting fires, which probably explains why they were better at the former. The corps included specialized personnel and duties, 0. 5. Aquarii and Siphonorii, who handled water supplies and pumps, meaning maintenance and logistics were part of the job as well as patrols. The force also had Medici attached to cohorts and Victimarii serving as chaplains, showing more institutional structure than pure improvisation. But this didn't solve their fundamental resource problems. The social dynamics created constant tension that made every interaction unpredictable. Because many vigiles were freedmen, their legal authority sometimes clashed awkwardly with the social expectations of free Roman citizens. The result was frequent friction during arrests and patrols. The vigiles had legal authority but social status lower than the people they policed, which turned routine arrests into humiliating confrontations for everyone involved. Their duties expanded beyond street patrols into public baths, markets, and civic spaces, where they checked for fire hazards and maintained order. This spread their already thin numbers even more, leaving some districts virtually unpatrolled, while others received minimal coverage. Bathhouses required constant monitoring because of their furnaces and heated rooms, but this meant pulling men away from street patrols where most crimes and fires actually occurred. In 24 AD, the Lex Vicellia offered full citizenship and a cash bonus to vigiles after 6 years' service, an incentive that helps explain why many recruits were freedmen or the urban poor. This wasn't just generous imperial policy, it was necessity. The job burned through men so quickly that without the citizenship incentive, recruitment would have been impossible. The vigiles were expected to prevent fires through vigilance, fight fires with inadequate equipment, police streets with insufficient numbers, and maintain order among citizens who despised them. They worked with broken tools, impossible schedules, and contradictory priorities that set them up for failure before they ever faced a real disaster. And in 64 AD, that real disaster finally arrived. The Great Fire of 64 AD was the ultimate test of Augustus's firefighting vision, and the results were spectacular in all the wrong ways. The Great Fire began on 19th July 64 AD, burned for 6 days, then rekindled. Contemporary accounts place the destruction at about 10 of Rome's 14 districts, effectively 3/4 of the city in some accounts. Flames erupted near the Circus Maximus and the merchants' stalls packed with flammable goods, then jumped to nearby apartment buildings and began their relentless march through Rome's densest neighborhoods. The vigiles responded exactly as they'd been trained, with leather buckets, soggy blankets, and complete confidence in tactics designed for kitchen fires, not urban infernos. Cohorts rushed toward the flames carrying their siphona pumps, which promptly clogged with debris from collapsed buildings. Their bucket brigades formed human chains that stretched for blocks, passing water hand to hand, while the fire advanced faster than they could carry their containers. The vinegar-soaked centones that had seemed adequate for small blazes proved laughably inadequate against walls of flame that towered above multi-story buildings. Firefighters threw their quilts at burning structures and watched them instantly ignite, adding fuel to fires they were supposed to extinguish. The ballistae brought out for long-distance water launching couldn't aim accurately enough to hit specific burning sections, instead splashing harmless amounts of liquid onto random parts of the conflagration. The tools and tactics that worked for small fires were overwhelmed by the scale and winds during the Great Fire. Contemporary writers report confusion, breakdown of normal command, and even accusations of looting or deliberate obstruction. The evidence is mixed, but the result was catastrophic damage. Entire districts vanished into smoke and ash. The campus marshes, the Aventine Hill, and vast sections of the city center turned into charred ruins. Chaos and rapidly shifting fronts meant command and communications were severely challenged. The urban environment and smoke made coordination extremely difficult. Ancient authors recorded that some wealthy men profited from fire sales. Crassus is a named example in classical sources. And rumors circulated that people sometimes let houses burn for gain. Historians treat such accusations cautiously, but they fueled public anger. Accounts vary, and later rumor blamed Nero, though the evidence remains contested. The political aftermath was swift and harsh. Romans who had tolerated the vigiles as a necessary evil now openly mocked their performance. The fire had revealed them as a bureaucratic fantasy, impressive on paper, useless in practice. Citizens who had watched their neighborhoods burn while firefighters stood around with broken equipment demanded answers that Augustus couldn't provide. The Great Fire exposed every flaw in the system Augustus had created 60 years earlier. His politically motivated fire department had crumbled when Rome needed them most, leaving the eternal city in ashes and its citizens questioning whether their protectors were actually capable of protecting anything. But for some vigiles, the disaster had revealed opportunities that went far beyond simple incompetence. The aftermath created a perfect storm of low pay, weak oversight, and desperate circumstances that made corruption almost inevitable. There are well-attested stories of private men, Crassus is the classic example, profiting from fires by buying burned property and using private crews. Contemporary sources and later writers also accused some watchmen or brigades of corruption or of being bribed to delay responses. Such charges circulated widely in popular complaint, though hard. Systematic proof is scarce. Because many vigiles derived income and status from imperial patronage rather than local wealth, opportunities for supplemental pay or collusion with private brigades created perverse incentives in some cases. Low pay, irregular oversight, and local discretion made the force vulnerable to corruption and collusion in some neighborhoods, a situation widely suspected by contemporaries and later writers. Property owners desperate to save their buildings offered payments that exceeded months of regular wages, creating obvious temptations for men who risked their lives nightly while earning barely enough to survive. The corruption followed predictable patterns within any underpaid, overworked service. Vigiles stationed near wealthy neighborhoods learned they could delay the response to poorer districts while negotiating with terrified property owners. Some firefighters allegedly arrived at scenes, assessed the situation, then decided whether their equipment would function properly that evening based on factors beyond just the technical challenges of the fire itself. Romans grew increasingly cynical about their fire department as stories of selective service spread through taverns and markets. Citizens began joking that the vigiles were more dangerous than the fires themselves, since at least fires were honest about their intentions to destroy property. The public's attitude shifted from grateful dependence to bitter mockery as they watched their supposed protectors operate with flexible standards during emergencies. Roman writers capture this growing contempt in their works, though they were careful to avoid direct accusations that might anger imperial authorities. The vigiles became stock characters representing incompetence and corruption in Roman literature. Writers portrayed them as bumbling fools, more interested in personal profit than public safety, stumbling through the streets with broken equipment and questionable priorities. Their reputation oscillated wildly between desperate necessity and public ridicule depending on circumstances. During quiet periods with few fires, Romans mocked the vigiles as expensive parasites who consumed tax revenue while contributing nothing useful. But when serious fires broke out, the same citizens who had ridiculed them desperately hoped these flawed firefighters might somehow save their property. The corruption and public contempt eventually attracted imperial attention that couldn't be negotiated away. The force's autonomy and reputation fluctuated over time as imperial oversight shifted, and their independence gradually eroded as higher authorities imposed accountability measures designed to restore public confidence. The Vigiles had evolved from Augustus's political solution into a symbol of how institutional design flaws could create lasting dysfunction that served no one effectively. Augustus's Fire Brigade reveals how even the mighty Roman Empire could create institutions that looked impressive on paper but failed spectacularly in practice. The Vigiles had official cohorts, military ranks, and imperial funding, yet they couldn't stop Rome from burning down around them. Their leather buckets and soggy blankets were no match for urban infernos, and their corruption made bad situations worse. Compare this to modern emergency services and the progress becomes staggering. Today's firefighters arrive with trucks carrying thousands of gallons of water, hydraulic ladders that extend dozens of stories, and thermal imaging cameras that see through smoke. They train for years, earn decent wages, and actually save buildings instead of watching them burn. Sometimes the most valuable historical lessons come from studying failure rather than success. The Vigiles show us exactly how not to run emergency services